so pleased today to introduce Dr. Laura Hirshfield. She's an assistant and soon to be associate professor in the Department of Medical Education and a faculty affiliate in the Department of Sociology at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She received her undergraduate degree in sociology, anthropology, and education at Swarthmore, a beautiful liberal arts college in Pennsylvania. She then went on to receive her PhD in sociology at the University of Michigan. Her academic work includes research on gender and other forms of inequality in academic and clinical settings, particularly in relation to medicine. She has some fascinating perspectives on the hidden labor undertaken by and expected of members of marginalized groups in the workplace. In this particular paper from 2011, she discusses cultural taxation to describe this burden where additional responsibilities are placed upon non-white faculty because of their ethnic and racial backgrounds. These responsibilities include serving on numerous committees, advising large numbers of students, and serving as departmental experts for their particular ethnic and racial groups. These expectations of non-white faculty are not placed as heavily upon white faculty and can impede career progress and job satisfaction. She's also done a lot of work on cultural competence, particularly in medical contexts. And this work is related especially to transgender patients. Here we have a standardized patient case for medical students that she created to increase their understanding and competence in this arena. She's also done studies in medical students regarding communication and emotions. In this study of graduating medical students, she showed that students with pre-medical humanities or social science majors performed significantly better in terms of communication and interpersonal skills than those with natural science majors. Additionally, she teaches several courses in the health professions school, including on leadership in the health profession, leadership and professional identity, and interviewing and ethnographic methods. She also teaches in the undergraduate and graduate medical education curriculum, primarily about inequality, identity, and bias, as well as patient-centered communication and empathy. She also mentors students. This is a recent graduate from UIC Medical School who's heading off to UNC for her ENT residency, who recently worked with Dr. Hirshfield. She really does it all. So we're so excited to hear Dr. Hirshfield, as a true expert, discuss professional identity formation, the case for a shift in focus from the professional to the profession. Thank you very much for being here.
I'm deeply honored to be speaking to you all. My talk today is entitled Professional Identity Formation, the case for a shift in focus from the professional to the profession. I have no conflicts of interest and nothing to declare, but I do have a small non-standard disclaimer as well. This is my first virtual keynote, so please bear with me. I want to begin by introducing myself to you all. I tried to pick the most recent picture I had of myself not wearing a mask. I am an assistant, soon to be associate, pending board approval, professor at the University of Illinois College of Medicine in the Department of Medical Education. I was trained as a sociologist, and my work focused on science and academia before I turned my interest to medical contexts and to health professions education. One of my major goals since joining the medical education community has been to think about what we can learn here in MedEd about issues of equity and representation from the work that's been done in science and math contexts. A key question guiding my talk today was this one: why are there so few women and underrepresented minorities in the field of radiation oncology? Questions like this are, of course, massive, so I will only begin to scratch the surface. That said, whenever I look at questions related to underrepresentation, I think both about what leads people to opt out of joining the field and what makes people leave the field once they are in it. When sociologists study these concepts, they usually use two overarching theoretical frameworks. One is the concept of the leaky pipeline, which is the theory that at each stage of training, hiring, and promotion into STEM, pre-med classes, majors, and careers, women and underrepresented minorities leak out or leave science or medicine more frequently than boys and men do. There is some evidence that low proportions in several fields of science and medicine are slowly shifting, which might reflect hope that the pipeline is leaking less. The concept of the chilly climate is one that explores how sexist, racist, or otherwise biased and isolating behaviors in the laboratory, in the clinic, in departmental and in administrative levels, as well as inequities in workload, recognition, and pay, can create disadvantages for members of marginalized groups. Here in medical education, one of the theories most commonly alluded to when talking about specialties and issues related to specialties is the theory of professional identity formation. It's also one of the ones we have really started to incorporate into our undergraduate medical curricula. And so I wanted to think about whether or not the theory of professional identity formation might provide some additional insight beyond some of the more traditional theories we usually use to examine these questions. So what is the theory of professional identity formation? There are dozens of definitions, but just to take a couple of the most common, professional identity formation is the foundational process one experiences during the transformation from layperson to physician, or it's the process through which people develop a professional identity. For those who are more visual, here are a few pictorial representations of the construct. Holden et al. Has shown us that professional identity formation is a combination of professionalism, identity, development, and formation. While Cruz et al. Depict a complex model that show a bunch of factors that lead into socialization, which in turn contributes to personal and professional identities. What's key here, though, is that these models demonstrate the importance of an individual's identity. However, as useful as the concept of professional identity formation can be, rather than focus on an individual's professional identity, I argue that instead we should focus on the identity of the profession. I'm going to elaborate on that for the remainder of my talk today. I also want to note, when thinking about the quote-unquote profession's identity, we can think both about the broader profession of medicine and academic medical training, as well as about the more specific specialty of radiation oncology. I'm going to talk about both in what follows. So how should we focus on the identity of the profession rather than on the professionals within the profession? What I'm going to do today is look at some aspects of the profession's culture and some aspects of the profession's structure to unpack issues related to the profession that may affect representation within these groups. I'll start with some cultural factors. One of the key ways that we can learn about the culture of a profession or a specialty is to look at the symbols, jokes, media portrayals, etc. for that specialty. A great example of this was posted by a medical student and shared widely on med student websites, including Reddit, Student Doctor Network, Twitter, and Pinterest. The artist drew a set of 12 medical specialty stereotypes, which originally included radiation oncology, but after an outcry, she actually replaced radiation oncology with internal medicine. But here is the stereotype she portrayed with the original. I have to say that the first time I saw this, one of the things that I found most notable was that the stereotype of radiation oncology is actually that there really isn't one. People don't know much about radiation oncology. And that, in and of itself, is a fascinating issue and a concern in terms of bringing people into the field, particularly bringing people in who are members of marginalized groups. Issues related to climate are also key cultural factors for us to investigate when thinking about the lack of women and underrepresented minorities in the profession and specialty. A recent massive study of U.S. medical students found that mistreatment is widespread, but that women, underrepresented minorities, and Asian students and lesbian, gay, and bisexual students bear a disproportionate burden of this mistreatment. Climate issues are also caused by negative interactions with patients, including harassment and challenges to legitimacy. Women physicians and physicians of color frequently face challenges by both patients and their colleagues related to their authority and legitimacy as physicians. There are dozens of visceral images of this sort of thing on the web. I've picked out a couple for you here. While neither of these physicians is in radiation oncology, these types of experiences tend to be widespread within medicine for members of these marginalized groups. Another major issue related to culture, and one that I've spent a large part of my career exploring, relates to representation within the field. Again, if you think about how people understand a specialty or a profession, it's really important to think about whether or not someone feels represented within that space and whether or not someone feels welcome in it. So, what are the areas in which someone can look at a field and say, am I represented there? Do I see myself in this space? One is in authorship. One of the things we know from across a number of fields is that women and people of color are less likely to be listed as first or senior author of published work. We heard from Zayed et al. Earlier today that this pattern holds true in radiation oncology as well, despite an increase in the number of women authors overall. We also know that white men are disproportionately likely to win grants and funding compared with women and people of color. This has important consequences for visibility and representation in terms of who has funded labs, who has funded research teams, and who is in the news for winning major awards. Basically, for who people see as the most successful scientists within a field. We also know that women and people of color are less likely to pursue academic careers and high prestige, high paying specialties for a number of reasons. But this lower representation obviously has important downstream consequences. Finally, women and underrepresented minorities have actually increased in leadership positions in academic medicine, but not at the national level. They tend to be in leadership positions that involve high levels of service and low levels of prestige, such as deans of diversity or program director positions. These positions are deeply valuable to the institution, but often don't provide many opportunities for advancement. More importantly, they also often face what is known as the glass cliff. Women and minorities are often appointed only into positions that are considered precarious, where the leadership faces many challenges and they may have issues moving forward. Along with cultural factors, there are also structural factors that impact how welcoming a profession can be for women and people of color. When thinking about workplace structures, one of the first things that any profession or specialty needs to pay attention to is work-family balance. Obviously, work-family balance is a big concern for everyone, whether they are single, whether they have partners, and whether they have children. But it's particularly something that is a concern for women and underrepresented minorities, who are more likely to live with or care for, financially or otherwise, members of their extended family. Women are also more likely to have spouses that are employed full-time than men are, and this can have important consequences for both household labor and childcare, as well as for how flexible women can be when moving for their jobs. Women spend more time on domestic activities and are more likely to take time off for disruption of childcare. This is especially true for mothers of young kids, who, on average, have less time to spend on their research and tend to have fewer institutional supports than fathers. So what are some of the structural factors we should be focusing on? One that I've been particularly thinking about recently is away or visiting rotations. As you all know, these are not considered core to undergraduate medical education, and they've been thought to create inequity for women and students of color. Some of the frequent concerns that have been discussed include their expense, because they often involve travel and paying rent in two places. They can create challenges for family if they have children, partners, or extended family that they care for, and they can create extra emotional pressure. There's been a lot written about the pressure of needing to be on all the time during your so-called audition rotations, all at the same time as you are away from your traditional home support. This is all not to mention the extra areas of inequity that may be added related to COVID. I'm not going to touch on those right now, but one that's been raised is that due to different regional responses to the pandemic, away rotations will become a variable resource. Some students from certain parts of the country will have them, while some will not. Another major structural factor that should be taken into account relates to the timeline for trainees. Here I've posted a pretty common US-based timeline for medical students. What you can see is that there is a pretty big cluster of things that students need to do early on in the beginning of their 4th year. This includes preparing their application for ERAS, taking their career rotations and away rotations, and taking their board exams. This pressure may well be a major deterrent for students entering specialties with particularly stringent expectations or tight timelines. Finally, other issues related to structure have to do with how policies and rewards are differentially provided within academic medical systems in our profession. Audit studies have demonstrated that men and women with identical records are judged differently, as are faculty of color compared with their white peers. As a result, marginalized members of the profession have to consistently perform at a higher level to be rewarded at the same rate as their white men peers. Women and people of color also do more uncompensated labor due to their identity. This is an area of research I've focused on for many years. In this work on identity taxation, we've shown that women and people of color are more likely to sit on diversity committees, to mentor students, to perform translation services, and to work with patients who are members of marginalized groups. This labor tends to not be rewarded officially. We also know that women tend to receive fewer outside offers for jobs, and that they are less likely to pursue such offers in general. All of these reasons together end up contributing to lower salaries for women and people of color. This is true in medicine broadly, and specifically here in radiation oncology. So how do we begin to address the question that was driving this talk? Why are there so few women and underrepresented minorities in the field of radiation oncology? Most of the strategies that try to address this issue start by looking at the individual, a sort of lean-in approach to asking individuals to adapt themselves to better fit the profession. Instead, what I argue is that we need to reframe and work to adapt the profession's cultural and structural identity to better fit those that we hope to attract. So what does a reframe look like? Let's first think about the cultural factors at work. We can begin by trying to shift some stereotypes. As we heard earlier today, one thing we need to do is increase exposure to the specialty so that stereotypes about radiation oncology are no longer this empty room, but actually include some knowledge about what radiation oncology looks like, and that it's actually a vibrant and important field. We also need to improve the climate, shift the culture, to provide support to trainees and clinicians who experience patient abuse, as well as mistreatment from their superiors. While we know that women and physicians of color face issues of legitimacy across all medical specialties, it's worth thinking about how imagery within radiation oncology could be used to continue to solidify and normalize diversity within our community. We also need to work to increase representation at a variety of levels so that people who are marginalized can see themselves in this field. This would involve an increase in representation on committees and in leadership. This is important not only so that women and underrepresented minorities can see themselves represented in those spaces, but also because there's evidence that increasing diversity in leadership teams helps to increase overall diversity through subsequent policymaking and hiring. We know that double-blind review also increases the number of women and people of color who receive authorship, particularly high-profile authorship. In fact, we heard a talk about that earlier today. We also need to change policies and structures to support membership by marginalized groups. So, speaking of structure, what does a structural reframe look like? We need to start by rethinking undergraduate medical education training models. This might mean shifting exposure to radiation oncology earlier in the timeline, again, making people actually know what the field is and the opportunities that are available. It may also be rethinking the emphasis on away or visiting rotations. This may be particularly important this year due to the pandemic. We also need to think more carefully about our reward structures. We need to think about modifying our search procedures and potentially eliminate outside offers as an opportunity for boosting salaries. Another important solution, though it's one I've received the most pushback on in medical education, is fixing terms for department heads or chairs. This concept has actually been promoted by some of the fantastic scholars here in radiation oncology as well. This sort of change is paramount for shifting the culture because there is strong evidence that frequently rotating leadership contributes to improvements in both diversity and in the likelihood of shifting cultural and structural norms. Finally, we need to be thoughtful about how much extra service we ask of women and people of color, or we need to modify our standards for promotion. In other words, we need to pay attention to the identity taxation that exists, and we need to value the work that they do. This may mean rethinking award requirements or promotion metrics. So, in sum, my goal today was to shift our focus away from professional identity formation to focus on reforming or reframing the identity of the profession itself. With this lens, I hope that we will all continue to make strides in making radiation oncology a welcoming specialty and a profession that women and underrepresented minorities will want to join and stick with. Thank you so much for your attention and your forbearance. I'm going to stick around now to answer questions, but if there are any that I don't get to, please feel free to send me questions at my email address here.